Hi, Year 11. Today we're going to be looking at the last part of our intercultural communication syllabus, and that's the potential for intercultural misunderstandings to occur and some strategies in order to overcome those misunderstandings or prevent them altogether. So we've spent the last little bit of time looking at Japanese culture, looking at the idea of them being a collectivist society, a high context society. So they all play a role in understanding how people should communicate with Japanese people. But there's some other sort of cultural quirks or cultural norms that people need to adhere to when communicating with Japanese people as well. The first one is around facial expressions, and Japanese people don't use a lot of facial expressions. They're quite blank-faced, and that's because they don't want to necessarily portray emotion, because they've got that idea of national identity and wanting to have group pride, and they don't want to give away their opinion, which might be considered shameful. So Japanese people will read your posture and your facial expression, but you might not be able to do the same to them. Japanese people in conversation also don't tend to use I, me, or my, again, because of that collectivist nature. They don't necessarily express their personal feelings. It doesn't mean they don't have any thoughts or feelings, but they want to maintain harmony. Westerners also don't normally get a no from Japanese people. They're very, very friendly, very, very welcoming, because no doesn't really exist in the Japanese language because they don't want to cause offense. So instead of saying no, Japanese people might give a really ambiguous answer if you ask them a difficult question, but that's just the nature of Japanese culture. Eye contact is another big one. Japanese people don't tend to use eye contact very much and only make eye contact with people that they deem to be of the same social status, of equal social status that they have. That's because they wouldn't want to make eye contact with someone that perhaps is their elder as a mark of respect. It would be disrespectful to look somebody who's in a higher position than you in the eye. So just because somebody isn't looking you in the eye when they're talking to you doesn't mean they're not listening. It actually means that they're showing you respect. Removing shoes is a really important part of Japanese culture, and it would be really important to remove your shoes before entering a Japanese home. It would be considered very offensive if you didn't, and this applies to religious institutions as well. Gift giving is really important in Japanese culture, but there are some rules around it. You should always take a gift if you're invited to somebody's home, but you can't give things that are white generally, particularly flowers and pots, because they're associated with funeral rituals, as opposed to perhaps white in Western culture is associated with purity and things like wedding dresses. In Japanese culture, white is quite a solemn colour. Gifts should be wrapped in certain ways, and bright colours shouldn't be used in wrapping paper. And receivers won't open gifts in public because they don't want to, I guess, embarrass the guest if it's not what they were expecting or if they don't like the gift. So they do that in private. When eating with a group of people in Japan, they always start the meal by saying itadakimasu, which is something along the lines of thank you for this food. It's kind of similar to a grace that perhaps Western cultures might say. They have fairly standard, similar rules to what Western culture would have, things like you wouldn't blow your nose at the table, leaving an empty bowl is a sign you enjoyed it, and it's customary for everyone to cheers together as well. The Japanese are not a fan of public displays of affection, and they're not a hugging sort of a culture. So it's okay for young couples to be seen holding hands, but you wouldn't necessarily see an older couple kissing in the streets or things like that. Friends might hug, but they're not a super touchy-feely culture. All of those aspects are often where miscommunication occurs. Someone perhaps doesn't understand the gift-giving culture or doesn't understand that they need to take their shoes off, and that's when some offence might be caused. And so it's really important to understand those aspects of a specific culture when you engage with that culture through communication. Other ways that misunderstanding might occur: language barrier is the big one. If you don't speak the same language, it's going to be hard to communicate, and therefore you might have a misunderstanding. If you don't have education, if you're closed-minded, you're holding on to stereotypes, all these sorts of things are reasons for intercultural misunderstandings. Miscommunication really is unavoidable, and so the best thing you can do to prepare yourself for communication with another culture is educate yourself, and then make sure that you respond appropriately. In a moment, I'll ask you to pause me and to go back to School Box and watch this little clip about some Japanese gestures, just to give you another idea about how different some of those gestures can be in Japanese compared to Australian culture and how easy it is for miscommunication to occur. Okay, I hope you found that interesting. Some of those gestures seem a bit backwards, like opposite to what you might have in Australia. So that's like another way that miscommunication can happen. There's one piece of due work for you today, and that's this question. What are potential understandings that may occur between Australians and the Japanese? Just needs to be a few lines. The very last part of our syllabus is overcoming cultural misunderstanding. What are the strategies we can use to make sure that we can move on from any misunderstandings that occur? The best and most useful strategy is cultural relativism. And we talked a little bit about cultural relativism when we watched that episode of An Idiot Abroad, and the idea that you need to actually understand that cultures are different. You need to understand that cultures are constructed depending on the society they exist in, and you must always look objectively at other cultures. You need to avoid being ethnocentric or ethnocentrism, which means placing your own values and customs onto the culture that you're engaging with. For example, you can't expect people in Japan to act and to have the same values that you would have as an Australian. This is from your textbook, but also I've uploaded it to Schoolbox if you don't have your textbook at home with you. And this is just some additional strategies for misunderstanding. Things like reading before you engage with other people, demonstrating patience, showing respect, things like that. And then there's a nice little infographic there too about the intercultural communicator and what they look like. Okay, that's it. We've finished the Year 11 syllabus. We have done everything we have to do for our course, and we are totally done. You have now the rest of this lesson, plus our lesson tomorrow, which is Asynchronous Friday, to prepare for your assessment next week. I will keep a Google Meet running tomorrow for the whole lesson. If you do want to join, there's no obligation because it's meant to be screen-free Friday, but I understand it is our last lesson before your assessment, so you might have questions, so I will be available if you have any questions. Otherwise, the time is yours to study, to revise. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. Make sure you think about how to attempt those depth study questions, the 5 marker and the 15 marker, because they are really where most of your marks come from in this assessment task. All the best.